The worldwide disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in numerous impacts on the environment and climate. As the pandemic unfolded, so too has the excessive misuse of single-use plastics, adding more toxic waste to our already over-polluted life support systems. To discuss this further, we're joined by Rico Euripidou, who's an environmental health specialist at GroundWork. Good evening, and thank you so much for your time, Rico. You know, plastic is really seen as one of the greatest evils to our environment right now, and there have been numerous campaigns to try and raise awareness. Are we seeing that the change is as dramatic and as radical as you would want it to be?
Good evening to you and your listeners. You know, the reason we have a plastics crisis in the world right now is because of the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry understood quite early on that the writing was on the wall for oil, and that the production of oil for consumption in traditional ways would decrease. And what they've subsequently done is reposition themselves so that they've made these huge investments to manufacture plastics. They see plastics as the future. Now, we have to understand that plastics along the full value chain are polluting. From the time that the oil is extracted in the ground, to the time that it's transported, to the time that it's refined, the air pollution, the communities that live on the fence line will testify how polluting plastics is along its full value chain. And what the plastics industry tell us is that we can recycle plastics. And more importantly, they tell us that we are the problem. It's our behavior that ends up with plastic being in the environment and plastic polluting the environment. But that's not true. They've never accepted responsibility for plastics along its full value chain. And the plastics that ends up in the environment is the plastics that cannot be recycled. Since plastics first started being produced in the 1950s en masse, only 10% of plastics have ever been recycled. So this is a fossil fuel industry driven environmental problem. And if we think about air pollution and we think about the impacts of air pollution, the World Health Organization tells us that between 7 and 9 million people die every year from air pollution. That's almost 10 times more people than have died from COVID already. This year, between 7 million and 9 million people will die from air pollution, and most of that comes from the fossil fuel industry. But even bigger than this is that drives climate change. And we are seeing climate change now in a big way for the first time. We are seeing these massive fires in California. There were fires in Australia just before these fires. The Val Dam is 1/3 lower than it was at this time last year. Gauteng will have a water crisis, the same way as the Western Cape had a water crisis over the last 3 years. This is the real big impact. It's climate change. And climate change is going to affect people. It's not an environmental issue only. It's going to affect people. And when people are affected, what happens? They migrate. The way we see migration happening to Europe, the way we see migration happening from Zimbabwe to South Africa, we are going to see the same kinds of massive impacts from climate change.
Rico, when you talk about, plastic, you include the entire value chain. So how does it travel from the point of production to where it ends up in a stream somewhere in the middle of the world, even though its origins may have been even in South Africa? And what culpability right now do the manufacturers and the producers of this plastic, do they have over this product? And have we done enough to ensure that they take full ownership of these products, even after use by consumers?
These are really good points. So let's start with where plastic begins. So plastic begins from the coal pits in Mpumalanga, where the land has been degraded, where we have acid mine drainage, where communities have been displaced because of coal mining, where we see communities that live right next to the coal-fired power stations that don't even have electricity themselves and that burn coal in their own homes. So they pollute it in their homes and they pollute it from the dirty environment. So let's talk about our ambient air quality regulations and the laws we have to protect people from bad air. At the beginning of lockdown, our Minister of Environmental Affairs allowed Sasol and Eskom. Sasol is the producer of plastic, and Eskom, a 2 times higher allowance than the national air quality regulations on sulfur dioxide. And we know sulfur dioxide affects public health. So industry doesn't care about the air pollution that they make. Eskom for the last 10 years and Sasol for the last 10 years have known that they would have to meet a little bit more stringent air pollution for the air pollution coming out of their stacks. What have they done? They've lobbied national government and our national air quality officer to allow them effective exemptions, what they call rolling postponements, effective exemptions from our air quality regulations. We know that in South Africa, 2,500 people will die from air pollution every single year because of that. So that's where plastic begins, in the Highveld, in the coal fields. When it is transported, those trucks damage our roads. They go through our communities with impunity. And road traffic accidents account for a huge burden of disease and disability and death in South Africa. We know that. We know that road accidents cause a huge problem in South Africa. So that's the second part along the value chain. Then we get to Sasol. Sasol is where plastics are made in South Africa, where plastic polymers are made. Sasol as a single entity is the single largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. Sasol emits more carbon dioxide than most African countries. It is so greenhouse gas intensive, it should be a country all on its own. And yet, what do we do to make Sasol comply with this climate damaging situation? Government does nothing. Let Sasol get away with it. We have to go to court to get Sasol to disclose how much carbon dioxide comes out of its stacks. You ask the people that live on the fence line of Sasol in Emalahleni, in Van der Bijl Park, you ask them about the air quality. It's among the worst air quality in South Africa. So that is just part of the value chain. That's up to where plastics are manufactured, the polymers are manufactured. And then never mind the downstream impacts of plastics ending up in the environment. So along its whole value chain, plastics are a problem. We should be banning single-use plastics. There is no place for single-use plastics. But the industry tells us it is our fault. It is you, the consumer, that are responsible for plastics in the environment because of your behavior. But you ask a poor person who lives in a township to manage their waste in a sound way. You look at our municipalities that are struggling with service delivery to give people basic water and electricity in most places in South Africa. You ask them to manage plastic in a sound way so that it doesn't get into the environment. It's almost impossible. So we cannot be responsible for single-use plastics. Right. Industry has to be responsible. If they sell stuff, they must be responsible for it.
Rico Euripidou from GroundWork. Let me thank you so much for your time tonight, Rico.